I'd like Melissa to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about who she is, what she does, and why LGBTQ plus activism has become something important in her life.
So my name is Melissa Sklarz. I'm here today at York College. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. Now, this is our LGBTQ activist forum. I'm not really much of an activist anymore. In fact, this past year I ran for the New York State Assembly here in Queens in the 30th Assembly District. Sadly, I did not win. I did very well. I would have been the first transgender public elected official in New York. That will remain for someone else. I started hanging around with trans women in the 1970s in Times Square. If you watch the TV show The Deuce, it'll give you an idea of what that was like in the old days. And I didn't transition until the late 1980s. What happened is I was really afraid, and so I decided, let me become a terrible, terrible drug problem, and then this way I lose everything and I could only move forward, because that's exactly what I did. And I hooked up with people in the Gender Identity Project at the LGBT Center in Manhattan. In those days, there was no internet, no Instagram, no Snap, there were no computers. There was no cable TV. And so it was word of mouth, it was going through the bars, and the idea of a group of trans women getting together and creating a community in the early 1990s and the late 1980s was revolutionary. Today it's old hat, but to be able to meet and talk to trans women in the daytime without alcohol was profound. And within a few years, they made me a peer counselor. And so in those days, it was empowering a community, bringing people together, and so we could learn through our own experiences. Again, revolutionary for the time. And so I would run support groups, and in those days, the girls would work in the stroll. Now, what would happen is there are no opportunities for trans women to work. And so they would all go out in the streets. They would go to what was then called the meat market on the west side of Manhattan, where they would chop up meat during the day, but they would leave at 3 in the afternoon and it would be this empty space, and the girls would all go and take part in their own meat market. And so we would do outreach. This was the time of HIV/AIDS, and it was terrible. It was death everywhere. People were dying, and so we were trying to educate people. Again, if you watch the TV show Pose, you'll see that replicated in, it's in Red Hook, Brooklyn. No, in those days it was in Manhattan. Today that same space goes for $1,000 a square foot, which is too expensive for anyone working the street. And so we were able to create community. And finally in the neighborhood, they started to complain about the girls working, and they had a public forum of 250 people. And at the Gender Identity Project, they said, you've got a big mouth, you went to college, do something. So I went there in front of 250 people. I stood up, I castigated them, how dare you say these terrible things? And they listened, and they got even with me. They put me on the community board. And really, ever since then, I've been involved in public service and community service. I've been involved in democratic politics at city, state, and federal level. I've worked with police force and aging and students and all sorts of things representing transgender people in New York City, New York State, and the United States. I've been invited to the White House to talk transgender, not this White House, the one before it. I've learned a lot. The most important thing, though, is to help create community, is to be able to bring people together in an environment where we all learn from one another. Now today we have the internet that's been able to take that experience and bring it online and bring it to the multitudes for all time, crossing all boundaries. But in the old days we had none of that, and now I can stand back, because even here in this room, in this college, I'm probably a little bit older than most of the folks, but I've done my share in training and educating the next generation and the next generation of great trans and gender nonconforming leaders, some of whom you'll be seeing here today. So right now I'm out of work, so if any of you want to hire me, you can do that. Contact me and I can send you my resume. To be here today at your college is amazing, and I look forward to hearing from all the other people here in our symposium, so thank you.
Great. Right there. Hi, my name is Neil Stone. I'm a transplant Canadian, and I've been here in New York City for 20 years now. Originally went to the University of Manitoba and got degrees in landscape architecture and city planning. I decided that before I settled into my career that I wanted to do some overseas service and do it through the nonprofit sector. And so one of the first things that I did was move to the Philippines and stayed there for well over a year doing human rights work. And what the Philippines taught me was, it really shifted my politics. And so gaining a real appreciation for how small the world really is. And when I came back to Canada, I didn't stay for very long before I picked up my first urban planning job in New York City, which brought me out here. And one of the first nonprofits that I did some association with was through the Filipino community, helping with migrant workers in their social situations. And we founded a nonprofit which was the Network in Solidarity with the People of the Philippines, which eventually gave wings to an organization called Damayan Migrant Workers Association for Filipinas that are undocumented and settling into predominantly Queens. But what that gave me was it gave me a tool set to know how to build nonprofits in the United States and how to continue that type of volunteer work. Just shifting back to the urban planning aspect, there was an issue within our professional association for the National Urban Planners, where I noticed that the Planning Association was making an overture to the Boy Scouts of America to have a pairing or a mentorship built between the APA, the Planning Association, and the Boy Scouts at a time when the Boy Scouts were not allowing any gay anything with the organization. And what bothered me the most was that if this would have gone ahead, it essentially would have asked people like me, gay urban planner, to go back in the closet if I wanted to participate in that particular type of program, that association program. And I didn't like that I was going to have to do that. And so I made a bit of a stink and wrote some articles and really petitioned the leadership of our 40,000 Planners Association. Unfortunately, maybe fortunately, when you make some noise, it elevates your profile a little bit. And so I was approached and asked to continue making some noise in the Urban Planning Association by being a little bit more of an activist. And so I ran for the position of our national LGBTQ division and served in the capacity as chair for 5 years. So in my tenure within the LGBTQ division, I advocated for other urban planners that may not have been aware at that time about the LGBTQ homelessness situation, the challenges that places unduly on the youth within our community, and how that then translates into effects for the overall community. And these have public health implications. These have homeless and crime implications. This is really the core of that particular issue. And so it was important to make sure that other urban planners knew and understood about what was going on with that. And the other issue that was important for me to raise within that vocation was how our Stonewall seniors, or our Stonewall generation, was beginning to sort of age out and move into their senior citizen years. And so what were we doing from an urban planning standpoint to prepare for our community as they were going to be moving into seniordom? So, but that was the stuff that I did with the Planning Association. I've also worked in Queens to help found one of the first LGBTQ Lions Clubs in the Lions Club International Organization, and we do community service projects throughout New York City. Most recently, because of the federal administration and immigration situation, we have founded an organization called Seeking Asylum Finding Empowerment, which is abbreviated down to SAFE. And what we do with that is we've got about 15 core members that provide know your rights, legal training, and basically social services or assistance for anybody that is a non-US national, LGBTQ focused, who is coming into the country and needs assistance. So we're busy, I'm busy. I think we're all here because we have a passion for what we do. And I would now consider myself to be a more seasoned volunteer or activist. But as a word of encouragement to anybody who happens to be viewing this and wants to do activism within the LGBTQ community, take a little bit of a risk, get involved, find something that you have a passion for. You're going to see a lot of people that have different skills and qualifications that are here today. Latch on to any one of us and join, get involved, and be active. Thanks.
We're going to pause for just 1 second. If anybody's having trouble hearing, you can come on up. You don't have to speak. The camera, you'll be too far away from the camera, but if you'd like to come and make a second circle, please feel free.
Stand in the second tier with me. I'm going to stand behind. This is that I can hear everybody.
This is great. Thank you guys so much for sticking on your 5-minute mark. So we'll speed it up. The big discussion. Oh, I'm sorry, Melissa. Okay, we're still rolling.
Please, introduce yourself.
My name is Paris Strotter. I'm trying to get in the camera. My name is Paris Strotter, and I'm a New York resident. I now work for the Department of Housing Preservation and Development on Queens and Staten Island issues, trying to build affordable housing here in Queens and Staten Island. But my LGBT activism really it started in where I'm from, Orange County, California, but really took root in Newark, New Jersey, and that's what I'll share some of those experiences with you guys today. When I moved to Newark, I was pretty young, fresh out of grad school, didn't have a lot of friends, had one friend in Newark, and connected with a group of friends who really wanted to get involved in the community, make some changes in Newark. And was amazing as even as a young person, you can kind of jump into leadership just by really rolling up your sleeves and doing the work and really kind of bringing yourself in an honest way, listening to people. And that's what we did. I got involved in the Newark Pride organization at a time where it was a very new organization. I participated in our first annual Pride Parade, helped to organize it, and soon became the president of Newark Gay Pride and led the organization for about 5 years. In that role as really a Pride organizer, which is really about what events cater to the community and how do we get folks involved, how do we make sure that our spaces are safe for youth, how do we get sponsorship for our events, how do we get businesses on board. As part of that role, you find yourself really becoming a leader. And what I found is that I was called upon not just to organize those events and build coalitions to produce a fruitful week of programming, but I had to be an advocate of every faction of the community. And Newark, probably not unlike Queens, I know Brooklyn has these challenges, is there's a lot of factions. So the LGBT community is not a monolith, as we in the community know. There are lots of cohorts. They don't always work well together or get along. So a lot of it is coalition building within the LGBT community, but also outside, to bring us all together. And found myself, I was working for the city at the time, City of Newark, and how do you bridge what we were doing in City Hall with what the activists are trying to do and advocate for? Really thinking about how to make our police more LGBT friendly, which is a big challenge in Newark. How to make our schools more LGBT friendly. We established an LGBTQ commission in the mayor's office in Newark during Mayor Booker's tenure, and I'm proud that Mayor Baraka has continued it now, to really put citizens of Newark who are allies and members of the LGBT community and really community leaders really in City Hall to try to advise the city on policies, on programs to make the city more inclusive. So we were successful in establishing that body. I chaired that body for 2 years. And out of that, one thing that we were able to do is that there were several organizations serving the community. Some of them had been serving the community for 20 years. But they each had kind of different missions, and of course there's overlap. There wasn't a unified voice. Through that commission, we helped establish a dream of the community for a long time, which was building an LGBT center in Newark. And we established that center. I'm proud to say it's still going. I was one of the founding board members. I'm now not on the board, but it's opened its doors, and that's one of the ways that we created permanent safe spaces for youth, but also for the entire community. And it gives an opportunity for the whole community to come together and really kind of make bridges where those factions were between the different aspects of the Newark LGBTQ community. The other thing I'd want to mention, also on the business side, we established the New Jersey Chamber of Commerce, headquartered in Newark, which was big because when people think of the LGBT community, actually several years ago there was a magazine article which said, you know, Jersey City and Asbury are the gayest cities, but they had like a top 10 cities. They didn't even mention Newark. And there's just such richness of the LGBTQ community in Newark. So that was really progress to say, hey, Newark can be the center of this community for New Jersey. And the Advisory Commission, actually, that's the first, now there's a couple others, other bodies like that in New Jersey, but that was the first of its kind in New Jersey. Back in 2010, we established that. So I would just say, you know, I'm kind of removing myself from Newark now that I live in Brooklyn. I'm trying to get involved in Brooklyn. I work on some other kind of national LGBT initiatives. I'm also a planner like Neil, so I'm on the American Planning Association LGBT division along with Neil. But looking now to get more involved in Brooklyn. But I would say that if you're a young person, you can really elevate yourself and get involved really quickly if you have the passion. And Neil mentioned something about this. Find out what you're passionate for. There's so much work to be done still to this day. And I don't have to remind all of us in the community what work is needed, but we need the hands to do it.
Hi, my name is Lakshman Kalasapudi. I'm from New York, born in the Bronx, raised in Queens. And I got involved in the LGBT community at a pretty young age, and kind of like what Melissa was talking about in terms of building community. It was more for myself than anything else, and suddenly you're kind of just thrust into this leadership position, or you just, you know, there's work to be done, and so you kind of gotta have to do it. I was involved with SALGA, which used to stand for South Asian Lesbian and Gay Association. That was founded in 1991. It's a volunteer organization in New York City for people on the gender and sexuality spectra who trace their descent from South Asia. And I was there from 2008 to 2010, and I was pretty young back then, and I helped out with organizing support groups, participating in Pride events, kind of raising visibility for queer South Asians. And I came back I got involved with Salga again in 2015 to 2017, or 18 earlier this year. And I took on a more hands-on role, given my previous background and experience. And the way I kind of see it is building visibility and awareness for queer South Asians within the South Asian community, which is definitely not a monolith. There are so many different religions, languages, immigrant communities right here in Queens. And so one of the really cool things that I thought we did was organize a panel on, well, it ended up being, unfortunately, only homosexuality, but homosexuality and Sikhism. And Sikhism is one of religions that comes from India. And the largest Sikh temple in New York City is in Richmond Hill, Queens. Sikh temples are called gurudwaras. And we got a couple of people of the Sikh faith to speak about what it means to be gay and Sikh in the largest Sikh temple in New York City, which was like a pretty conservative, as religious communities could go, conservative environment. And it was all in the Punjabi language. And that's kind of what it means to me to be an activist, is meet people where they're at. Don't have like these unimaginable expectations for them. And so we were, that was a small event, kind of like this, but it kind of made a deep impact in the people who were there. And yeah, it was just really special for me to be able to do that. And then on the flip side of it, raising South Asian voices, immigrant voices in the larger LGBTQ plus or general mainstream community, for example, raising the voices of queer Muslims after the Pulse nightclub shooting was something that we took to be really important. And so that's kind of what I've been doing as an activist in New York City over the past few years. I am now transitioning into a career change, and so hopefully I'll come back as a medical professional and serve the community in years to come.
Switch it? Oh, okay. Okay. Hello, I am Jeremiah Jerkowitz. I'm the LGBTQ Resource Center Pluralism and Diversity Coordinator at the College of Staten Island. So like so many of our speakers, my journey began with trying to help myself, right? I moved to Staten Island from Baltimore, Maryland in 2008 for college, and I went to a private all-boys Catholic high school. And it was a great school, but I never had a sense of community there in Baltimore. And I was able to find that in Staten Island by going to the Pride Center of Staten Island and joining our Gay Straight Alliance on campus. And lo and behold, they needed leadership positions filled, so I fell into that as vice president and eventually president of the club. And as our student meetings that we had once a week, we found that a lot of students were coming into our meetings with very real issues that we could talk to them and support them, but we didn't feel like we had the resources to support them or help figure out these issues. So we got together and we said, well, our meeting once a week for 2 hours in a classroom isn't enough for our campus because there's so many students coming through our doors. So we got together, we made partnerships with some faculty and administration and staff, and we advocated for the creation of an LGBTQ resource center on our campus, which it took a couple years, but we were able to get that opened in spring of 2012. And it was a small room to start, but we thought it was important for something to be open more than 2 hours a week on our campus for students. I eventually came into the role when the graduate student who was in that position went on to teach. And we moved just last spring into a bigger space. And with that bigger space came more students. So I've really seen the impact that just a small space on our campus has made, right? If it didn't exist, these students might have never met one another, might not have been able to create these friendships, create this community, and seek out the resources and support that we have. And I just went into this position full time in September. So it's brand new for me, and I'm really excited to serve our community in such a local specific way on our campus. And because we are a CUNY campus, just like your college, we're serving all types of students, right? We're serving the working class community. We're serving a more and more growing diverse population, even in Staten Island. It's getting more diverse, and with those come different backgrounds and different issues that these students face. For activism, I find that a lot of people, it can be this big beast, like how do I become an activist? And many times you can just look right around you and see what's missing, what's lacking, what needs to get better, and you can help with that, right? I didn't really expect to become an activist. It was just something that I just kept rolling with, and it became a career for me, and the job that I get to do now as kind of being an advocate on our campus for our LGBTQ students and all students of diverse backgrounds. And I've also done some work with our Pride Center of Staten Island, serving on their Pride Fest committee, helping to organize Pride festivities, which I think are so important in every region of our country. It doesn't need to just be centralized to one main hub. It can be smaller celebrations everywhere. So it's been a real honor, and I'm thankful to be here with all of you. Thank you.
Yes, here. Excuse me. My name is Aiden J. Kaplan. I use he, him, his pronouns. I currently serve as the LGBTQ Youth Services Manager at Pride for Youth, which is located out on Long Island. We were the first suburban LGBT center in the United States, which has led to a lot of the different advocacy efforts that our agency does. Like most people here, my advocacy efforts started for myself. I came out as transgender at the age of 13, started to transition in my freshman year of high school, and my school had no idea how to handle me or what to do. So I had no choice but to advocate for myself and teach my mom how to become an advocate for me as well. And I think as I got older, a lot of my advocacy opportunities were kind of handed to me. They weren't chosen by me, but handed off to me. When I was 19 years old, ABC News was doing a kind of expose on what it meant to be a trans person, and someone that I knew kind of mentioned my name, and I got pulled into this entire follow you around for a whole day, learn your story experience. And through that work, this national video going out, I ended up getting a lot of calls from people who wanted me to come and speak and wanted me to come and present on panels. And it was not something that I ever kind of saw myself doing. I had no idea what I wanted my future to look like. And then all of a sudden, this kind of pathway was presented in front of me that really made a lot of sense and didn't make sense to resist against. I went to Purchase College and got a degree in gender studies and human sexuality just to make sure that I was doing something related to the LGBTQ community, but I had no idea, again, what I wanted to do with that. When I graduated, or right before I graduated, I was lucky enough to get an internship at Pride for Youth, which is where I work now. Through that internship, I was able to learn the skills of advocacy, of education, of realizing how much power youth have and using that voice and helping to build up that voice a little bit to help to move our movement forward. When I left my internship, there was nothing available, and I kind of left things open and was like, if anything opens up, I'd love to come back and work here. But again, still had no idea what I wanted to do. And I actually went to Italy for a couple of months and did a study there on working with transgender individuals in Italy. And through this project, really realized that this just made sense for me, that working with my community made me feel empowered, made me feel like I was giving back to a community that had done so much to build me up. And while I was in Italy, I got a phone call from Pride for Youth offering me a position. And I came back and started working there. I've been there for 4 years now. Through my time at Pride for Youth, I went and got my master's degree in social work. I'm now a master's level social worker, licensed master social worker. And like most individuals who have spoken before, most of my advocacy is related directly to education. I started off in our agency working as the head community educator and going into schools and doing presentations on understanding homophobia and understanding transphobia. And that is one of the most pure forms of activism, of really going into spaces and providing education to those who really want to learn about this community. Their prejudice doesn't necessarily come from a desire to be prejudiced, but a lack of experience and a lack of education. Through that role, I started to work with local legislators and legislators on a state level to have just conversations about what it meant specifically to be a transgender person in New York State, but also a conversation about how much more the movement needs to go and how much more work needs to be done. That's been brought up a lot in the conversation as well. And there's so much to be done, that there's so many people that need to be involved in the movement, and anyone who's willing to step up needs to be involved. But a lot of my desire to become an activist and really kind of finally claim that word for myself came out of meeting with legislators and realizing that it's not that they didn't care about moving policy forward in some cases, but in a lot of cases it was they just simply didn't understand our needs. And if I can get a group, especially a group of youth together, to go and meet with the legislator and just be a facilitator for that conversation, that I walked out feeling empowered. I walked out watching these youth that I was working with finally feel like their voice mattered, finally feel like they had something to say and what they said was worth listening to. Most recently, I am trying really hard to honestly just piss off a lot of legislators, show up in people's offices and find out what they're working on, and instead of creating new policy, get involved in what they're currently working and make it LGBTQ inclusive. So a great example of this is about 2 months ago, actually, Nassau County passed a bullying bill specifically for public schools in Nassau County, which is where our agency is housed. And I went to the legislator's office who was writing this bill and got involved in the legal process to actually include language around sexual orientation and gender identity. So a lot of policies are being written that are great policies, but need someone in the room who can lead it where it needs to go, or at least make sure there's some kind of inclusion. So a lot of what I'm working on right now is just finding what's already being done and getting involved in that process, because there's great people out there doing the work. They may just need a little bit more of the education about why we need to kind of go a specific pathway or change some of the language. And some examples of that are, while writing this anti-bullying bill, they were going to use the term LGBTQ. And if anyone here has ever written policy before, LGBTQ in all caps really brings people's attention and awareness to the fact that this is written in a bill. But writing gender identity and sexual orientation are just words, and they kind of just disappear within text. So when you're trying to get something passed and you don't have both sides supporting a specific community, having just words versus a huge acronym is really helpful to get something kind of pushed under. So a lot of what I'm doing is kind of doing education in that sense of getting people to recognize that there are other ways to do things to get things passed when we really need things to pass. Most recently, I am thinking about running for political office. In my master's degree, I ended up doing a lot more of a policy focus, and my professor in policy was actually the chief of staff of a Nassau County legislator, and she's kind of giving me a lot of push to get involved in that work. But I am right now kind of making the decision between staying in the nonprofit sector, which is where I feel most of my passion is, or deciding to take that step and go political. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. I, like most of the people I've mentioned before me, getting involved in political work and getting involved in activism are really important. Everyone has the ability to do it, even if you are not a public speaker. Every person, especially the youth, I'm always pushing to get youth involved. Every person has an ability to say something that matters. Every person has a perspective that should be heard, but often you're not encouraged to do so. And I was lucky enough to have people in my life who encouraged that. And a lot of what I'm doing now is hoping to encourage that in the youth that I work with.
And of course, as both Aidan and I know, New York City has transgender civil rights protection. Suffolk County has transgender civil rights protection, but Nassau County does not have transgender civil rights protection. Perhaps in 2019, New York State will have transgender civil rights protection to protect all of us.
And you are correct, it does not. What I will just add really quickly is that Nassau County about 6 months ago re-upped the writing of our version of the gender bill in Nassau County. So we just call it instead of a name. But I was in the room for a lot of these conversations. It did not move forward, but hopefully next year we'll have another chance and we'll see that happen.
While we're still talking about civil rights, we do know that Trump's Justice Department doesn't see issues around LGBT civil rights as a civil rights issue. That, I think, is the hardest nut to crack, is to get to the federal level, where, as we did with marriage, as we did with same-sex marriage, that idea that our rights are not civil rights that need to be fought for, that's a problem. I just wanted to keep it going while we were talking.
Great. And I want to talk a little bit about marriage equality in that fight when I talk about my experience with activism. So I'm J.R. Shahansky. I am the director of programs for the Queens region for the LGBT network. The LGBT network has 25 years of history, starting with education in classrooms, doing LGBT advocacy and support services. And we're in Queens now with a beautiful LGBT center in Long Island City, so I invite you all to come check it out. For me personally, I will echo what a lot of the speakers have already talked about, and saying that getting involved in LGBTQ plus activism was personal. And then kind of naively I entered and said, going to do some LGBT youth work and work one-on-one with LGBT youth and make a difference in their lives, and soon really very much became clear that policies and culture and all of the things surrounding each individual that I worked with, had such an impact on their lives that activism became the natural extension of being a social worker and being in the helping profession and wanting to make an impact on an individual LGBT youth's life. So got into a lot of education, and really, I think what solidified it for me was doing leadership education for LGBT and youth of color, and hearing their stories and being a cisgender white gay man, acknowledging my own privileges and my own biases, and thinking back on times when I said homophobia is the last kind of acceptable prejudice, and now in 2018 we see that that's not true, and that was a lesson that doing the work really opened my eyes and start talking about not only homophobia, heterosexism, transphobia, and those things, but the intersections that people face in their identities and the communities that they belong to and their backgrounds, and how all of those things build on each other and create lack of opportunities or lots of privileges for different groups, and being aware of those things. As I said, had the opportunity in some of my work to be really involved in the marriage equality fight in New York State, which was an amazing thing that people really started coming together and doing lots of activism, from demonstrations, letter writing, meeting with legislators, and actually getting it passed in New York State, and being part of that beautiful time was great. On the flip side, knowing that gender has been floating around state government in New York State for at least 10 years, if not more. And the Gender Expression Non-Discrimination Act has not come to a vote. It's been floating around in the legislature, but never got to the floor many, many years. Hopefully this year with Democratic State Senate, it might actually move forward. But knowing that the fight for marriage equality often kind of sidelined a lot of the more vulnerable people in our community, like people of color, LGBT youth, transgender people, means that we have tons more work to do. I'll also talk about the fact that during that time, there was a big push to get funding and services for LGBT homeless youth in New York State, and that also got kind of brushed to the side in the fight for marriage equality. So I think activism is greatly important, but there's still a lot more work to be done, and I'm so glad that we're having this discussion and talking about these things, and that there are great many organizations around Queens doing this work. So I'll leave it at that, but young people, we need you. There's still more work to be done.
Okay, well, my name is Owen David. I'm not really involved in activism, but I'll tell you a little bit about my background. So I applied to a doctoral program in educational leadership, and at first I was trying to decide where my dissertation was going to go, and I was going to focus on education. But then I decided that I wanted to switch to something that was more personal and relevant to me. So my dissertation studied and contextualized the experiences of LGBTQ faculty. And in doing that, I found that it was really important to focus on how we create safe work environments in a heterosexist culture. And so now I'm finished. I'm trying to figure out how to continue that work. I've been brainstorming. My writing has stalled a little bit because I have so many ideas, but even coming here today has given me a lot of information, and especially when you talk about gender equality and stuff like that, for me, getting participants to participate in my study was really difficult. And I only had one transgender participant who eventually withdrew. And it's unfortunate because there are so many voices that aren't heard. And it's relevant now in this society that we are heard and that inclusive and supportive environments are there so that we can champion our own causes. And hopefully events like this, discussions like this, will continue to create alliances and support groups and communities where LGBTQ issues are the focus, and we are continued to be taken seriously. As you discussed earlier, it is a civil rights issue, and it's one that we need to definitely not only spearhead, but get allies that are going to stand at the front lines with us. So I'm really glad to be here, and I'm learning so much, and I appreciate all the feedback that you give, and thank you for having me.
Okay, so my name is Deborah Gretsch, and unfortunately I'm not really active in the LGBTQ community, but I'm very thankful to be here today to educate myself and hear everyone's unique stories. And as an archivist at the LaGuardia and Wagner Archive, I want to contribute to archivally preserving everyone's stories in order to make this information available to everyone who wants to learn about the LGBTQ community. So thank you for having me here.
So one more? Yes. There we go. Yes.
Hello, my name is Ariana McGlashing. I am a student at York, and I'm here to educate myself more about the places or parts that everyone here takes in helping me, somebody a part of the LGBTQ plus community, finding themselves and helping others. And everyone else is here for personal reasons. That's how it started. It started out for friendship and accepting my friends, and then later finding out that, this is where I also fit in. So I want to share this experience with everyone else, even though the background that I come from isn't really one that is open to it. I hope that I can educate myself in that way so that I can share it with other people and generations coming forth. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. I hadn't planned on speaking today, but I was kind of just inspired by all of you being here, and especially I'm interviewing Melissa later on for the archive and researching her history. I have to say that you inspired me, and all of you inspired me to look inside myself and see. I never considered myself an activist, but then I thought, I kind of got the ball rolling to start the very first LGBTQ employee group at Queens Library, and we work on services both internally and externally with our customers, and we have several initiatives coming off of that. And we had 55 people march in the parade for the first time, and it was in our 120-year history. We had our first meeting back in June, so I kind of humbly think of myself as a little bit of an activist now, thanks to all of you.
You are an activist. I'm going to take that from you because I just realized in listening to all your very inspiring stories that I've only talked about myself as a felicitator. And one of the things that I struggled with was having to order my identity. Who are you today? Are you functioning as a female today? Are you functioning as an African American today? Are you functioning as a lesbian today? Which one of my identities and our many identities do we put forward? But this idea of not really thinking of yourself as an activist, if you're living an honest life, you are an activist, especially if you're coming forward as a member of the queer community. That makes us each an activist in our own personal lives, in our own professional lives. There is no way that you can avoid being an activist because, unfortunately, it's still considered a moment when people say, oh, you mean you're not straight? What do we do with that? So as a person who is living an honest life, we are encountering people that we're educating every day. So, Thank you all for being here. We're gonna be fed soon, and we'll welcome another group of folks, and I hope you'll all stay for the entire symposium. And come in here, Dan.
Another section. There's the opening section.
There is an open session, so is there anyone who wants to join in? Or is there anyone who wants to drop a coin and say, let's talk about... No?
So I'll get it started. So one of the main reasons why you guys are here, why we invited you, was not only for your activism, but your specific, unique view about activism in New York City, specifically Queens. So with the Future American Retrospective in Queens Memory, some of the things we're looking to talk about are things that are hyper-timely. So within the past week, within the past 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years even, what are some of the concerns that LGBTQ plus activists will have in the future, and what are some of your worries? What keeps you up at night, and what drives you every day? So that's what we're looking for. I'm going to get rid of this, because this is a conversation piece. Feel free to talk over one another, as long as you're respectful, and we actually have a productive conversation, okay? So we get about 20-25 minutes for this section, and this is really where the meat is, now that we all know each other and we're comfortable around each other, okay? So, thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
How does the group feel about the announcement of one's preferred pronouns? In the classroom, I have had to be very cognizant of that amongst my students, and it's a matter of respect, but I've also dealt with people who have said, come on now. Really? Do we have to be that specific?
It's kind of interesting because when you spoke about who you are within each day, I think about an experience I had, because as you see me, you see a black man and identify as a black gay male, and it was an experience I had with a colleague who used the term flamboyant to describe me. And I had to have a conversation with him. I said, it's not that I take issue with the word, but you're labeling me. I haven't introduced myself as such, and I feel like I have autonomy over my identity. And I just beg to correct you with respect. And I think that it's very important for us to identify ourselves, and you have to, it's kind of, as a double minority, as being a black man and being as a gay man, it's almost difficult because you have to try to sift through the intentions of people's words and their actions. And so it's very important, I think, within the LGBTQ community that we feel emboldened to speak up, and that we are encouraged that we have these dialogues so people know how to approach us and how we should be respected.
I have something to say. I get that the pronoun is there to help you to identify yourself, but some days you do not feel like this is the right pronoun. So, well, I'm the only one here with like 2 different pronouns on. So, like some days I will accept people, her, she, and I will feel okay with that. But some days when they stick on that label, it's like, no, just say they. I'm okay with you not even saying anything. Just say my name, that's fine. Just stick with that label. And I think that the pronouns, even though that they're here to help, like it's like putting you into a box some of the times, and you don't really like, you're a circle, you're not supposed to be in a box, you have a different shape of your own. So like you have to really like change the perspective of everyone around you for you to like have that like internal like aspect of it to say, well, today I feel like I don't want to accept anything other than my name. And that is okay once you know that in yourself, that is how you feel comfortable.
Yeah, I wanted to build off of a couple of points that were made earlier. And one thing that I think is a pervading theme with a lot of the stuff that we do is ensuring that we're creating spaces that conversations can take place in, and safe spaces where people that are maybe on the younger end of the spectrum actually feel that they can tell their story. Aidan mentioned, the storytelling is one of the most powerful things that we can each bring to the table to change people's minds, to change the status quo. And one of the things I didn't mention when I was doing my preamble is that as the marriage equality thing was going on, my then spouse and I were married in Canada, and thought, great, I'll be able to move down here and have the same privileges that a heterosexual couple would have. And we found ourselves being drawn into the whole marriage equality debate and going and telling our story for about 3 years in the run-up to when marriage equality was decided with the fall of DOMA. I was in an interracial relationship, and many times in telling our story to the politicians in Washington, they would look at my spouse as the immigrant, Asian American, and look at me as the American. And when I opened my mouth and had the Canadian accent, suddenly there was a revelation that took place. But what's important is that those spaces are created, the relationships get built, and the stories get told so that you actively are changing the minds of other people and building tolerance.
So one of the things I discovered that educating elected officials was easy, passing laws was easy. The hard part that takes forever is changing the culture. And we're seeing that now. I won't even bore you with the amount of time and money it took for me to be she and her, so I'm going to own that fiercely. However, gender fluidity is our current generation, and they are as fierce about this new way of perceiving themselves. Authentic identity is the key that all of us are here in this circle, is we're only here because of the work we put in to be authentic. And if a new generation demands to be seen as they and them, then as a seasoned activist, it's more important that I support that, just as people allowed me to create my authentic self.
If I can, sorry. I want to respond to the question, but I also want to give challenge the question a little bit. So in the sense of the question, I absolutely believe that we should always be asking pronouns. That's why when I introduced myself, I shared mine. I believe strongly that we should never ask a person their pronouns without sharing our own. It's very important to put yourself on a level playing field. But I also want to challenge the word preferred. It's really important that we never use the word preferred when asking a person's pronouns. And I joke a lot about, like, I prefer to not sit in traffic on the way home from work, right? Like, I prefer to not have difficult things go on in my life. I don't prefer the use of my name or prefer the use of my pronouns. It's my name, my pronouns, and it should be respected. So I think it's just really important to also make sure that we're using proper language when having this conversation to avoid that word, to remember to empower those who are sharing their pronouns. And also remember that when we go around and do our pronouns, someone has every right to say, I'm not comfortable sharing, or just use my name, or whatever it is, and leave that space open for that dialogue as well.
Yeah. And to add on to that, I think it's going to be odd until it's normal, right? Like with culture has changed, right? And things that weren't normal are now normal, right? So if we get into the normal practice of introducing ourselves with our pronouns and asking for others to do the same, it's just, in 10 years, it's going to be like, oh, we had a problem with that? Why was that such a big deal, right? Because pronouns, we use them so often to refer to ourselves and each other, and I think there should be a way for, like, a gender fluid person to, update it, right? Like, oh, today I'm going by this, and so I work with students in classrooms, right? And I tell professors, like, well, are we making this easier for ourselves or harder for yourselves, right? So something I want CUNY to do is have it available in CUNY First, the system that has all of our students' data, right? Have pronouns be an option. Yeah, so that when professors get their rosters, the students who mark their pronouns automatically have them, right? Or if you're just saying you do, a lot of professors know that their students do not use their college email, right? So they'll survey the class to get some info, include pronouns on there, right? So students who want it can mark it, students who don't care won't mark it.
The only negative with that is because, as we've discussed already, pronouns are consistently evolving and can change within the moment of the day. If you put it on your roster the day you start school, that pronoun can change. One of the things that I love, I don't know if any of you know Etsy, I love Etsy. Etsy makes a pronoun pin that has a spinner on it. So it's got a bunch of pronouns on it, and you can spin whatever you're feeling that day or within that moment. And I love that because a lot of my clients will wear that, and it's super helpful for me to not consistently have to ask you your pronouns, because a lot of times it can be bothersome if you're asked a bunch of times a day or a bunch of times a week, but to have that there, make sure that I'm never doing something that's not quite right for you.
So you're talking about gender fluidity. The freedom to be who you are in the moment.
Can I pull on a thread of the original question you asked that I think might not have been completely addressed, which was, I heard you say something about like people going, oh, we have to talk about this now, which is the kind of cisgender people in the room who aren't exposed to conversations about pronouns or gender identity, and like, oh, this is another thing I have to learn. And I think, you know, the very nuanced conversation we've been having about respecting a person's gender identity and the pronouns that they use and all that is wonderful and needs to be happening, and creating spaces for gender pronouns to be shared is important. And also to all those cisgender people who are like rolling their eyes about this new thing that they have to learn, no, they do have to learn it. Yes, it is something that's important. It might be a very small part of the population that's using different pronouns or using pronouns that you might, as a person, not expect them to be using, but yeah, it's important. And I had a conversation with my sister, who I love, and we have a very complicated relationship, around the term cisgender. And she's like, that's a term I have to, like, she used the term transgender, was fine with that, and I was like, and she's like, but this is a term I have to learn now, like, what's the point? And I'm like, because we can't just say transgender and not transgender. Like, we can't just other this whole group by like, they get a label, but everyone else is normal. And I think that that's a little bit of what I heard in your question, and I think it's important that whether or not pronouns are asked on a form or asked in a, you know, opening class survey or done on a wonderful button, which I'm totally looking on Etsy for that, creating the space where that conversation is happening for everyone, especially the people who are not exposed to it, is the important part.
And it's a way to disconnect assumptions, because we all know what assuming does. So, you know, if we can stop people from being assumptive, would be great. Ume is a new person in the circle.
I have a story that I want to share. My name is Ume Salma. I'm a student here. I actually came today because Professor Tang invited us to join. So I said, okay, let me go and see what this session is about. It's a story about 30 years ago. I came from a small village from Bangladesh, and my brother had a friend who was different, and then society treated him differently, and then at one point he stopped going to school. And at some point, I don't know what happened, I was so little, I didn't know, he committed suicide. So then I as a little girl, I thought about it. I was like, why did the society treated him like that he decided to commit suicide? So I'm so glad I came today. People like you working on policy and rights, and people like that, we should treat everyone equally. It doesn't matter what religion or what gender they are like. It's something that I think it's something that it's like it's natural. It's not something that people like him. Like everybody was different, but he was different. It's naturally he felt like that, or he was growing up like that. So I'm glad I came, and thank you so much for sharing all the stories that you guys had. Especially like he went to a Sikh temple and talked about it. It's very impressive. Like, you know, I know how conservative those society can be. Accepting those even like those speeches is hard for them to.
And so we live here in Queens, and Queens has 100 different cultures, and some of them are wild and crazy and lefty, and some of them go back hundreds and hundreds of years. And those of us in the circle and our friends that are watching, all of us have seen all that different concept of culture here in Queens. And for us to be authentic, it's really important how much time and effort it's going to take to educate our neighbors and our parents and their parents. And, you know, rather than always talking, it's important that young people can really lead the way, because there's so many different cultures here in Queens. You know, we heard briefly about transphobia and homophobia. I mean, mostly, I don't see that. I mostly see racism. As a trans person, you know, when I went to buy my apartment, all they wanted to know was the color of my money. So we're moving past that, and because I've got a big mouth, I get to have that privilege of being authentic and teach people whether I realize it or not. And hopefully as I do it, as you are doing it, because there are still cultures in Queens County that trans, they don't even get gay or lesbian, or even being short or left-handed for that matter. And it's really important that all of us, whether we identify as activists or not, just stand and be authentic.
I agree with what Salma had to say about like how accepting gender identity as equal, but some people, they don't really accept it due to their tradition. It's like what they're used to. They were grown in a specific way, so they're like, no, I won't accept this. It wasn't like this before, but it was indeed like this before. It just was not exposed to the public like we are now. And well, also for the people of color, it's really harder because even I went to one of the prides recently to support my friend, of course, myself. And they were like, what are you guys doing here? You're not a part of this community. And for some reason, I felt like I did not belong there. And it was not for me, it was for other people. And I felt like a certain way, but then I saw like other people, although it was a small amount of people of color there, I was like, but this is where I belong. There's somebody there too, there's somebody there. So if they can come and show their support, and even allies of color there to show their support, why can I not be a part of that community?
I have a question. I'm curious, and you know more about the experience that you had, but I'm so curious if some of that response, and I have so many friends who have shared with me that they've had this response when they go to pride parades, because they very frequently are gay cisgender male spaces, that could that comment have been absolutely about race as well, but also about a feminine presentation, or about a view that that was not a space for anyone who was feminine? Because I've heard a lot of comments like that as well. I'm curious if that was built into this at all.
To be honest, I don't believe that it is a part of it, because there were other people there. There were my friends, of course, gays, lesbian. There was like more masculinity, because we were scared as women to walk by ourselves because we didn't like really feel safe. So they were also there. So there was like 75% masculinity and 25% femininity. And to hear something like that, it was kind of like, no, this is not really for me then. Maybe I should step out of the way.
And a lot of our work is doing that coalition building, because you know, in our spaces, there sometimes are, you know, kind of focused or predominantly one part of the community, and then how does that intersectionality, someone mentioned this before, play in terms of you know, how do we reach out to immigrant communities, people of color, African American communities? The work we were doing in Newark was very much about, you know, LGBT or gay men from one neighborhood that were predominantly Puerto Rican and Dominican were not interacting at all with African American lesbians. And just figuring out how to build those bridges is really hard. Oftentimes, the first thing is people feel alienated, and oftentimes people will alienate or push people away purposefully, unfortunately. And a lot of what we have to do is figure out, well, how can we do the work to come together? And it's not easy. It can be comfortable to be in a space. I'm half black, half white. It's comfortable for me to be in, you know, a cisgendered male space, gay male space. But I have to push my comfort zone, and I have to figure out, how do I reach across, and how do we bring our community together? Because that's, without each other, we can't make the community better, we can't push forward.
I want to pose one more question before we break for lunch. So, you know, what makes the advocacy and what makes the advocacy in Queens different than anywhere around the world, even from Manhattan, from that perspective? Because, you know, we're the largest urban area in the world, and so much history has happened here in New York City. What makes us different? What makes this place different? from an advocacy standpoint. So I pose that question to you guys.
What makes Queens different?
What makes Queens different?
I think kind of what Marissa was saying, and working in a library, we work with demographics a lot to make sure we're representing the people in our communities. And there's like 170 languages in Queens, like the most diverse place in the world. That seems to be one of the most unique spaces and one of the biggest challenges, but also if you can unlock that diversity somehow, and it kind of talks about what you were saying, with building bridges between those that we need to work on sometimes.
I would also like to include, I believe, like as you both said, religion and culture have a lot of impact on advocacy in Queens. With so many cultures here represented, you know, how you were raised, how you were indoctrinated, especially by religion, really impacts you. And culturally, it really is important to probably highlight the similarities rather than the differences, because I think that the fear of the unknown and seeing everybody as, oh, they're from this region, they speak this language, blah, 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 it separates us. But if you see that you're coming towards a common inclusive goal, then I think that advocacy becomes a much broader topic that we all could embrace and then perpetuate.
I will say it's like kind of exhausting to do that work. And I'm one to complain a lot. And I feel like with those dozens or hundreds of different communities, languages, and whatever religions, cultures, you end up like, one, just patting yourself on the back, or at least I did, patting yourself on the back when you get two groups together in a room, like, you know, for 45 minutes or something to be talking about, you know, something shared. And so that itself is difficult. And then those kind of coalitions or those comings togethers take so much work, and they might not be permanent either. Like, they might be temporary. And so it's this kind of like temporary evolving mosaic that is really hard to like put together. So I'll just to like, if people have best practices or like thoughts on how to make it work long term, because it's really hard.
I found it easier to be white and trans in Astoria and Sunnyside and Woodside, but Maspeth not so much. So in my campaign, I went to the Juniper Park Civic Association, 250 scowling elderly white faces looking at me, and I'm talking bus and transportation and property taxes, and they're not hearing any of it, and they're just looking and scowling at me. They hated me. And when the votes came in, I did very, very badly in Middle Village. But I'm telling you that somewhere the seed was planted. And you know what? It may not help me, but when Aiden runs for office, they're going to go, oh, yeah, you know, we've heard from before. And so it may not always go the way you want, but it's important to stand there. Boy, they hated me in Middle Village, I got to tell you, but that's the district, and it's up to me to do the best presentation for their needs, whether they go for it or not. That was my experience in Middle Village and Queens.
I think that a number of us have opportunities to speak to large groups. And one of the things that happens in Queens, at least I see it in my classroom, is that I have a lot of very different people listening to me. So those opportunities, when you have a group of people before you, those are the opportunities that you have to educate them about, even just by saying who you are and then going on with your lesson. That they could think, oh my goodness, you know, there's a queer person and, you know, she knows history. That kind of thing. So I think the activism is carried within you, and the opportunity here in Queens is that they're going to be a diversity within the gatherings that you have an opportunity to talk to, be it, you know, student organizations, etc. That's when you can start, and it will push out from there.
I think also being so close in proximity to Manhattan makes it a challenge for LGBT advocacy in Queens, because everyone, whether they're straight and cisgender or queer, LGBT, thinks that for LGBT stuff you go into Manhattan. And that's where the funding goes, but that's also where a lot of the people go. But Obviously, you know, as our borough president likes to say, we're the world's bureau. We have people from like 190 countries living in Queens. So there are LGBT people here, and really making people aware, both the straight community and the cisgender community and the LGBT community, that we're here and not everyone's going into Manhattan, you know, to do their LGBT stuff. And that people are making their whole lives here, you know, across the ages as LGBT people, and that the advocacy and the services and all of those things need to be here is a challenge that we have to rise to.
Being in Staten Island and us being the smallest borough of New York City, I find that Staten Island, Brooklyn, Queens, Bronx all suffer similarly, where all the funding goes to Manhattan, and we all kind of fight against Manhattan individually rather than banding together saying, hey, we all have a huge majority of the city's population, and services should exist in our boroughs, and more services, so that you can travel to Manhattan if you want to, but you shouldn't have to travel, because we have a lot of lack of services in Staten Island. Besides my office being at the college, we have the Pride Center of Staten Island. That's really the only two for an entire borough, where if Staten Island was its own city, we'd be the second largest city in New York State. So we're still a lot of people, but when you put the 0.5 to the 8, we look very small. But a call out to Queens, remember your small sibling to the south, right? But if we band together, we're stronger than individually fighting for that funding, those resources from Manhattan, saying that, no, probably the majority of stuff should be going to the other 4 boroughs, because we technically have more residents in the other 4 boroughs.
One of the exciting things about Queens for me is how we all kind of have different sectors or areas or organizations that we do our annual work in a very diverse borough. And something like Queens Pride, which is kind of like a coming together annually of organizations, community service organizations, just, you know, fun, colorful bars and floats and things like that. Anybody that has been involved in any of the prides anywhere in the region knows that hell hath no fury like the NYPD when a float gets stuck in a tree and suddenly the parade comes to an absolute stop. And if you happen to be in charge, you know, it's your job to try and figure out how you dislodge the float from the tree. And I think the best thing that happened when I was working with Queens Pride, that, and speaking to your point, had longevity that they continue to do, is we introduced a pairing of GSAs, the Gay Straight Alliances, with the high schools in Queens to come into the Pride organization and get involved and actually contribute something to the Pride festivities of the day. And so it's those types of opportunities and building those types of things that don't die out after a year or two, but they establish a track record, and you utilize the event of Pride as a vehicle to continue building that sense of community. So.
Lavender line.
So I think that just sums up this first section of today. I thank you guys all for coming out so early this morning.
Yeah.
We're going to have a keynote address and some remarks, some spoken word stuff, and we're going to have lunch. I encourage everyone to stay for the gender fluidity panel. There'll be a lot more discussion during that panel.
Yes.
Much shorter introduction, much more discussion. And I'm starting to tell that really the good stuff is coming from the discussion. So I really do encourage everybody to stay for that. That should start promptly too. If you guys have a microphone on, Shirley right over there will de-mic very quickly. Just go on over there and they'll take care of it so we don't lose anything. And thanks so much. Enjoy the lunch. I'll see you in the fall.
I lost my little microphone cover.